Okay, so with 4 terms, most of the time they're going to be in the proper order that you need them in. Sometimes you might have to rearrange. But when we have 4 terms, we're going to factor by grouping. And what we do is we take and we start with the first 2 terms. Okay? I'm just focusing on those 2. And what I want to know is, what do those 2 terms have in common that I could pull out? Just those 2. An x squared. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to pull out an x squared. And then in parentheses, we're going to write what's left, again, just with those 2 terms. I'm not worried about the second 2 terms yet. So if I divide x to the third by x squared, what am I left with? X, okay. And then I bring down the minus sign. And then if I divide x squared by x squared, I'm left with 1. Okay, and then I'm going to close my parenthesis. So far, so good. Then whatever that sign is in the middle, we're going to bring that down. And then we're going to focus on the last 2 terms. And we're going to repeat the process. We're going to see what is it that they have in common. We're going to pull that out, and then we'll write what's left in parentheses. What did 2x minus 2 have in common? 2. Okay, so we're going to factor out a 2. And then if I divide each one of those terms by 2, what's left? X minus 1. What do you notice about the stuff in the parentheses? It's the same. That's the goal. Okay, the goal is to get whatever our leftover stuff is to be the same. Okay, if they're not the same, then we didn't pull out enough. Okay, or either we might need to rearrange our terms. So if I'm looking now try that one more time. If I'm looking at a whole now, I have x times x minus 1 plus 2 times x minus 1. And since those parentheses are the same, it's like pulling out another GCF. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to write that stuff that's in the parenthesis. I'm not changing it. And then I take whatever's left over, this x squared and that plus 2, and I put it in a second parenthesis. The order in which you do that doesn't matter. You could put the x squared plus 2 first and the x minus 1 second. Okay, the order of the parenthesis doesn't matter. What is important is that you have x minus 1 in one of your parentheses and you have x squared plus 2 in another. And then, like we did on a couple of problems yesterday, we just want to make sure that we cannot go any further. In both of my parentheses, I have 2 terms. The only way we can go further with those 2 terms is if they are both perfect squares or both perfect cubes. So if I look at my first parenthesis, x minus 1, are those both perfect squares? No. Okay. If I look at my second parenthesis, x squared plus 2, are those both perfect squares or cubes? No. Okay. What that tells me is I'm done factoring. That's exactly how I leave my answer.
Why would you not square it?
Because you're pulling it out. It's like, so now when I have it written like that, what we have to think about is we now only have 2 terms, because remember, terms are separated by plus and minus signs. So we're looking at what do those 2 terms have exactly in common. Just like if I had like that, what do those 2 have in common? We just pull it out and we write what's left. We don't square it twice. Okay, it's just a binomial instead of just one term. Does that make sense? Okay. I want you guys to try number 2 then. Same process. Focus on the first 2 terms together. Pull out what they have in common, and in your parentheses, write what's left. Then you focus on the second 2 terms. What is it that they have in common? Pull that out. Write what's left. The stuff inside your parentheses should be exactly the same. If it is not, then you didn't pull out enough, or you might need to rearrange. However, I'm not really going to give you any that you need to rearrange. I'm going to have it set up nicely for you. And then once you do that, you want to see to make sure that you cannot continue to factor. If you can, then we'll need to break them further. If not, then we're good. What is it that my first two terms have in common that I can factor out? An x, okay. Maybe. Try that again. Okay, and then when I do that, I'm left with an x squared minus 1. Okay, then that middle sign, I'm just going to bring it down. And then if I have 2x squared minus 2, what do those two have in common? A 2. All right, and then I have an x squared minus 1 left again. Remember, the goal is to have these two to be the same, which they are. So because they're the same, I can factor that out, x squared minus 1. My leftover stuff, the x plus 2, goes in my second parenthesis. And then we just need to look and decide if we're finished or if we can continue to factor either one or both of those. Looking at your first binomial, x squared minus 1, are those either both perfect squares or both perfect cubes? They are both perfect what? X squared and 1. Perfect squares. Okay, so we can actually continue to break that down. Okay, this one right here, just like we did yesterday, we set up our two parentheses. What's the square root of x squared? X, so that goes in the front. What's the square root of 1? 1, okay. Oh, come on. And then with our signs, we put 1 plus and 1 minus. And then I'm going to look at that second parenthesis, that x plus 2. Can that factor any further? Are those both perfect squares or cubes? No, they're not. So I just need to bring that down because it cannot break down any further. And so now I am completely factored. Okay. Because that x squared minus 1 were both perfect squares being subtracted, then we can break it down a little further and then just bring down the x plus 2 because it can't. Everybody kind of okay with those? All right. Now, take a minute and write down number 3. This one is going to be slightly different, and I'll tell you why here in just a second. The process on this is still the same, but what I want you to notice is what is my second sign this side? The first two, it was a plus, right? This time it's a minus. So we're going to have to treat that just a little differently, but we're going to start exactly the same. Focusing on your first two terms, look at what they have in common, and pull that out. What is it that 2x squared and 2x have in common? A 2x. Okay, so let's factor out that 2x. And then when I do that, what is left? X plus 2x divided by 2x is just 1. Okay. Now here's where a little bit of a change is going to happen. I am going to bring down that second sign like we did before, but now I'm bringing out a -1 technically, okay? We're going to look to see if those other two terms have anything in common, but we're going to have to be careful when we write what's left in our parentheses. If I look at these two terms, x and 1, do they have anything in common? No, other than a what? A -1, okay? So they don't have anything in common, but I am going to pull out, you have to pull something out, even if it is just 1. Now, if that had been a -2x minus 2, we could have pulled out a -2. But because x and 1 only have 1 in common, we have to pull something out. And then when we write our leftovers, this is where we're going to be careful. What is -x divided by -1? This is what I'm focusing on right now. This -x divided by -1 is what kind of x? Positive. So when I put it in here, that's going to be a positive. And then I'm going to do exactly the same thing. If I have a -1 and I divide it by a -1, what kind of 1 does it become? A positive. Okay. If I don't remember to divide each of those by a negative, essentially changing their signs by the leftovers and the parentheses, my stuff's not going to be the same. Do I have the same thing in my parentheses now? Okay. So we'll pull that same thing out, the x plus 1. And then our leftover stuff, the 2x and the -1, is going to go in the second parenthesis. And then I'm just going to ask you, can either one of those parentheses continue to factor? Are x plus 1 and 2x minus 1, are they both perfect squares or cubes? No, they're not. So that is all I can do here. So try 4. Okay. Same process because that second sign is a minus. So when you pull out what's in common, it has to be a negative. And then when you have the leftovers, make sure you change the signs of what's in common. What do my first two terms have in common? An x squared. Okay, so let's pull that out. And what's left? X plus 1. Now, because my middle sign is a negative, when I'm pulling out what's in common, it's a negative whatever they have in common. What is it that those two have in common? A 3. Okay, so when we divide it, we're dividing it by a negative 3. So think about this. I'm going to take that first term, the negative 3x, and I'm going to divide it by a negative 3. What does that leave me with? Just x, okay? And then I'm going to take the negative 3, and I'm going to divide it by a negative 3, which results in what? Positive 1. So we're going to put the plus 1. Again, the goal is this stuff in your parenthesis has to be the same. When we do that, we pull that same thing out, that x plus 1. My leftovers go in the second parenthesis. So in my second parenthesis, it would be x squared minus what? 3. Can either of those break down any further? Or either one of the terms in my parentheses both perfect squares or both perfect cubes? No. So that's as far as you can take that. Okay, so the only thing is with the grouping, you just have to be very careful. If your middle sign is negative, make sure, like right, come on, make sure that when you do it, you're pulling out a negative number and not a positive, okay? Otherwise, you're not going to end up with the same stuff in your parentheses. Very good? Last two, I want you to try both of them. Okay, so these both are a little bit trickier because we can do this one of two ways. I'm trying to think about which way is the better way to do it. What is the very first thing we always ask when we factor, no matter what, that we didn't ask the first 4 questions? Do we have a GCF? Okay. Now, before, when we did the first 4, we did focus on the GCF, but only 2 terms at a time. But sometimes all 4 of your terms can have something in common, and I'll show you both ways that this can happen. So let's first look at our terms, 3x to the 5th, 15x squared, minus 9x squared. Oh, that's supposed to be an x to the 3rd. First of all, change that. Sorry, that's my typo. Change that to an x to the 3rd. what do all of my numbers, because I don't have variables in every term, but what do all of my numbers share? A 3. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to pull that out first. That would be x to the 5th plus 5x to the 3rd minus 3x squared minus, what is that going to be, 15? Now we can focus on factoring it with just the 2 terms at a time. I'm going to hold on to that 3, and I'll fill it in the end. Looking at my first 2 terms, what is it that those have in common? An x to the 3rd. Okay. And if I pull that out, what's left? X squared plus 3. Right? Does everybody agree with that? If I divide 5x to the 3rd, just not 3. How about 5? Now that's maybe why y'all were looking at me funny. Is everybody okay with that part? Okay. And then when we're looking at our second terms, first of all, this is a minus sign, so we're going to bring it out. But what do those share? A 3. Okay, so we're going to divide each one of those terms by a negative 3. If I take negative 3x squared and I divide it by negative 3, I'm left with just a positive x squared. And then if I take a negative 15 and I divide it by negative 3, that leaves me with what kind of 5? Positive. Okay. Do I have the same stuff in my parentheses now? Here and here? Okay. So I'm going to pull that out. And then my leftover parts, the x to the 3rd minus 3, is going to go in that second parentheses. And then again, I just brought that 3 down that I pulled out originally. That's one way you can do it. However, if you forget to look for your GCF first, it will still work. Let me rewrite this problem. Nope. Okay, let's look at it the other way. Focusing on my first 2 terms, what is it that they have in common as is? 3x to the 5th and 15x to the 3rd. What do we have in common? 3x to the 3rd, okay. And then if I write what's left over, that gives me x squared plus 5, correct? Okay. Then we're going to bring down our minus sign. And then what is it that 9x squared and 45 have in common? A 9. And if I divide negative 9x squared by a negative 9, I am left with a positive x squared. And if I divide negative 45 by a negative 9, I'm left with a positive 5. Inside my parentheses is the same. My leftover stuff goes in that second parenthesis. However, we have to always check to see if we can factor completely, or factor any further. The x squared plus 5 don't have anything in common. They also are not both perfect squares or perfect cubes. But if I'm looking at that second parenthesis, 3x to the 3rd minus 9, don't they still have something in common? What do they have in common? A 3. So what I'm going to need to do, okay, and I can just stick it in the front, is divide each one of those by 3, which would leave me with the x to the 3rd minus 3. So essentially you get the same answer as long as you continue to look to be able to continue to factor once you do the grouping, okay? So you can do either method, whichever one makes more sense. If you forget to look for the GCF first, it can still work out. It's just you're going to have to make sure you leave it. If you left your answer, like if you did it and you left your answer like this one right here, I wouldn't count it completely wrong. I would just take a point or 2 off because it's not completely factored. Is everybody kind of okay with that? All right, then try number 6. That one will work the same way. You can choose which method you want to do. You can either, if you remember, pull the GCF out first, or That GCF can come out after you do your grouping. You just have to remember to keep looking for it. Decide which way you want to do it. If you want to pull the GCF out first, and again, that is the way you should do it. I forgot to remind you that we're supposed to look for GCF first. Just when you're factoring, make sure if you do pull that 2 out first, that you bring it down to the end once you finish factoring completely. Which way do y'all want to do it? Do you want to pull the GCF out first or wait till the end first? Okay. What is it that all 4 of our terms have in common? A 2. Okay. So I'm going to divide each term by 2 first. What is that, 36? Okay. Then we can focus on what we have here. What do those 2 terms have in common? X squared. And if I divide that by x squared, I'm left with x minus 9. I'm going to bring down that negative sign. What do those 2 terms have in common? A 4. And if I divide negative 4x by negative 4, I'm left with a positive x. If I divide 36 by negative 4, I'm left with negative 9. Just don't forget that 2 has to come down. My stuff inside my parentheses is the same. And then my leftover parts go in my second parentheses. Am I finished? Which one can still continue to factor? X squared minus 4. Everything else is going to stay the same and just come down. The 2 and the x minus 9. And to break up this x squared minus 4, I'm going to split up my parentheses. I take the square root of x squared and put that in the front. Hey. Okay. I take the square root of 4 and put that in the back. And then I do 1 plus and I do 1 minus. Is everybody okay with that?